Imagine your nation's capital ablaze, government buildings collapsing into roaring infernos, your president fleeing through darkened country roads, foreign soldiers marching unopposed through abandoned streets. This nightmare became America's reality on one sweltering August evening in 1814. August 24th, 1814. British redcoats entered Washington without firing a single shot at the city itself. The battle was already lost miles away. Public buildings burned through the night like funeral pyres. Why did American defenses collapse so catastrophically? Admiral George Cockburn had dreamed of this moment for months. American newspapers called him a brutal monster, a savage. He embraced that title with pride. Now he stood before the American Capitol, torch in hand, savoring his revenge. His reputation would be carved in flame. You need to understand something crucial. This was the only time since the Revolution that foreign troops captured America's capital. Not during the Civil War, not during any subsequent conflict. Only then. Only the British. Only in 1814. America's greatest humiliation. But how did 4,000 British soldiers defeat 7,000 American defenders in mere hours? How did Washington fall without meaningful resistance? The answer lies 50 miles southeast, where enemy ships anchored and an audacious invasion began that would humiliate a young nation. This is the story of strategic brilliance colliding with catastrophic failure, of extraordinary heroism overshadowed by incompetence, of a 15-year-old enslaved boy who saved history itself, and of nature intervening with devastating apocalyptic power. Washington burned. Then everything changed forever. August 17, 1814. 4,000 British veterans disembarked at Benedict, Maryland, 45 miles from Washington. These were not ordinary soldiers. They had defeated Napoleon's legendary armies in Spain and France, battle-hardened, disciplined, hungry for victory against their former colonies. Major General Robert Ross commanded the ground forces. Irish-born, educated at Trinity College, Dublin, a man who always led from the front lines. Yet Ross harbored profound doubts about this mission. 50 miles to Washington, far from naval support, deep in enemy territory. Admiral Cockburn felt no such hesitation. He had raided Chesapeake towns for months, burning and destroying with methodical cruelty. Americans offered $500 for each of his ears. He calculated that Washington could be taken easily. Ross reluctantly agreed to the audacious plan. Picture Ross that steamy morning, standing before his assembled regiments. 48 years old. Weighing the risks carefully, his duty demanded caution. His orders demanded aggression. Which voice would he obey? He chose audacity. The army marched northwest toward the capital. Destiny waited ahead. In Washington, panic spread like contagion through government corridors. President James Madison called out the militia desperately. But America had no regular army nearby, no professional soldiers, only farmers, shopkeepers, clerks hastily assembled. 7,000 men gathering near Bladensburg to face British steel. Brigadier General William Winder commanded the American defense. He was a Baltimore lawyer, not a career soldier. Winder positioned his forces in 3 separate defensive lines. The fatal problem? These lines couldn't support each other effectively. Confusion plagued American planning from the start. August 23rd. British forces advanced steadily through Maryland's oppressive heat. American scouts reported their approach with growing alarm. Madison himself rode out to inspect defensive positions personally. The President of the United States, present at the battlefield. Unprecedented. Brave, but ultimately futile against what was coming. At the White House, First Lady Dolley Madison prepared for the worst possible outcome. She gathered critical state documents frantically, stuffing them into leather trunks. Her husband sent penciled notes. Be ready to flee immediately. The enemy seemed stronger than initially reported. Total destruction might be their intention. Dolley faced a choice that would define her legacy forever. Abandon everything and flee to safety? Or risk capture to save national treasures? British soldiers boasted they would parade her through London streets in irons. She knew the danger intimately, yet she stayed. August 24th. Noon approached under a merciless sun. British forces entered Bladensburg, a small town northeast of Washington. American troops fired across the river, forcing the British momentarily back. For one brief moment, defense seemed possible. Then the British deployed their secret weapon. Congreve rockets screamed across the blue sky like demons unleashed. These were experimental weapons, 12-pound iron cylinders carrying incendiary charges. They flew unpredictably, howling and trailing thick smoke. Their psychological impact far exceeded their actual accuracy. American militiamen had never seen anything like them. Terror took root. One British officer later wrote mockingly of the Americans, "Never did men with arms in their hands make better use of their legs." It was cruel mockery, but devastatingly accurate. The rocket's red glare broke American nerves completely. The first defensive line collapsed almost immediately. I need you to imagine something. You're a Maryland farmer holding a musket you barely know how to fire. You've never been in battle. Suddenly, rockets shriek overhead like demons. Smoke everywhere, officers shouting contradictory orders. The man beside you drops his weapon, runs. What would you do? The Second American line folded just as quickly under the relentless assault. Soldiers abandoned precious cannons in their panicked retreat. Terror swept through the ranks like wildfire, spreading. Officers tried desperately to reform defensive positions. British troops advanced relentlessly, professional and perfectly coordinated. The route toward Washington lay open, but one grizzled man refused to break under pressure. Commodore Joshua Barney commanded the 3rd Defensive Line with naval discipline. A naval officer commanding land forces. He led 300 sailors and 100 Marines. They positioned artillery on a commanding hill, determined to make the British bleed. Barney was 55 years old, white-haired and weather-beaten, a veteran of the Revolutionary War decades earlier. He had destroyed his own flotilla days before, rather than let it fall to British hands. Now he made his final stand on unfamiliar land. His men prepared to fight. The British assault crashed violently against Barney's hill position. His artillery fired down the slope, cutting through advancing redcoat ranks. British casualties mounted significantly for the first time that bloody day. Marines and sailors fought desperately with boarding pikes and naval cutlasses, shouting, "Board them," as if attacking enemy ships. For 20 crucial minutes, the line held firm. Barney's men repulsed frontal attacks through sheer determination and superior positioning. British commanders realized direct assault was suicidal against such firepower. They adapted their tactics quickly. The veteran 1st and 44th Regiments began flanking movements around Barney's exposed left side. Barney saw what was happening with sinking dread. Encirclement was inevitable now. He ordered his men to retreat 3 separate times before they finally obeyed reluctantly. Then a musket ball struck his thigh violently. Barney collapsed in the middle of the dusty road, unable to walk, surrounded by loyal sailors. British soldiers found him there in the road, bleeding profusely. They recognized his rank immediately from his uniform. Instead of treating him as a defeated enemy, they congratulated Barney sincerely for his extraordinary bravery. Officers personally called for medical treatment. They later released him on parole, honoring his courage. Respect transcended enmity. But Barney's heroism couldn't save Washington from its fate. The Battle of Bladensburg was over completely. 3 hours of fighting had shattered American defenses like glass. The road to the capital stood utterly undefended. Ross and Cockburn's gamble had succeeded beyond their wildest expectations. Total victory achieved. President Madison witnessed the crushing defeat from a nearby hillside. He scribbled urgent messages to his wife. "Flee immediately, no delays." Then he himself retreated hastily, riding south across the Potomac River. The President of the United States, running from enemy soldiers on American soil. Unprecedented humiliation. Back at the White House, Dolley Madison received her husband's desperate warning. Around her, Washington residents fled in absolute panic. Wagons clogged the narrow roads. Thousands abandoned their homes frantically. The First Lady remained remarkably calm. She had one final sacred mission before escape: save the Founding Fathers' image. Gilbert Stuart's portrait of George Washington hung in the state dining room. Full length. Priceless. The Founding Fathers' stern image gazing down disapprovingly. Dolley Madison pointed to it and made a decision that would echo through centuries. "Save that picture," she commanded her servants firmly. Paul Jennings stepped forward immediately. He was 15 years old, enslaved since birth. Born at Montpelier, Madison's sprawling Virginia estate. Now he faced a moment that would define his entire life. Save the portrait or let it burn. The British were approaching rapidly. Every minute mattered desperately. Jennings tried removing the frame intact first. Impossible, it was secured too firmly to the wall. The First Lady's voice cut through the chaos sharply. Break the frame apart. Use a knife on the canvas, if absolutely necessary. Under no circumstances, allow it to fall into British hands. White House steward Jean-Pierre Ciassat and gardener Thomas McGrath joined Jennings quickly. Together they smashed the wooden frame apart with tools. The canvas was freed carefully. Two family friends, Jacob Barker and Robert DePaster, carried Washington's portrait away to a farmhouse for safekeeping. History was rescued. Dolley Madison climbed into her waiting carriage. As it pulled away, she looked back at the mansion she had transformed into America's social center. Would she ever see it again? The carriage rattled across Long Bridge toward Virginia. Behind her, Destiny approached on British boots. Late afternoon, August 24th. British soldiers entered Washington completely unopposed. Residents had abandoned the city hours earlier. Eerie silence replaced usual bustle. Ross and Cockburn rode at the column's head. 4,000 disciplined troops controlled America's capital without firing a shot. Humiliation was complete and total. Ross issued strict orders immediately. Burn only public buildings. Private property must be completely spared. Soldiers who disobeyed would face severe military punishment. Despite his fearsome reputation for ruthlessness, Ross maintained professional military discipline strictly. This was strategic destruction, not mindless violence or looting. Cockburn felt very differently about restraint. He wanted to burn everything, the entire city reduced to smoking ash. Ross restrained him firmly. Their disagreement revealed two philosophies of warfare: controlled retaliation versus total devastation. Ross's view prevailed ultimately, but the destruction would still be catastrophic. Picture Cockburn's thoughts as he surveyed Washington triumphantly. American newspapers had vilified him relentlessly for months, called him a monster and butcher. Now he held their precious capital in his palm. What sweet revenge this must have felt. He smiled broadly as the sun descended. Evening fell swiftly. British soldiers marched to Capitol Hill with torches. The Congressional Building loomed before them, symbol of American democracy itself. Cockburn personally supervised preparations meticulously. Soldiers piled furniture, books, documents inside, everything combustible. Then came the torches. Flames erupted skyward immediately. The Capitol burned with spectacular intensity. Both wings engulfed in roaring fire. The Library of Congress inside consumed entirely. 3,000 irreplaceable books reduced to ash. Centuries of accumulated knowledge destroyed in mere hours. Smoke billowed across Washington, visible for miles around the devastated city. Next, soldiers marched to the president's mansion purposefully. The White House stood empty, recently abandoned in haste. Cockburn reportedly sat mockingly at Madison's dinner table, still set for a meal never eaten. He ridiculed the absent president while dining on his food, then ordered the building torched immediately. Flames consumed the presidential residence hungrily. James Hoban's architectural masterpiece, opened in 1800, became an inferno. Interior destroyed completely. Only the outer shell remained standing. Later, it would be painted white to hide smoke damage. Hence the name White House. The Washington Navy Yard burned. Treasury Building burned. War Department Building burned. Across the city, government structures erupted in flames systematically. The night sky turned orange and red. British soldiers worked methodically, building by building. Strategic destruction executed with military precision and cold efficiency. But one target held special personal meaning for Cockburn: the offices of the National Intelligencer newspaper. This publication had printed scathing profiles of him for months, called him a savage and disgrace to humanity. Cockburn wanted personal revenge on these journalists who had vilified him so thoroughly. He ordered the newspaper offices destroyed completely, but not just burned. Cockburn wanted every single printing press demolished. Soldiers smashed the equipment with methodical fury. He reportedly told them to be sure all the letter C's are destroyed so the rascals cannot abuse my name anymore. Personal vendetta fulfilled. Throughout the night, Washington burned under British torches. Residents who had remained hidden watched in horror from darkened homes. The sky glowed like daylight from the flames. One eyewitness wrote, "The sky was brilliantly illuminated by the different conflagrations. America's capital was an inferno." George Gleig, a British officer, later recorded his impressions. He described the systematic destruction, the troops' discipline, the absence of resistance. His account provided a soldier's perspective. Professional duty performed efficiently. No remorse. No hesitation. Orders followed. Victory savored. Yet even in destruction, moments of humanity emerged. British soldiers helped extinguish fires threatening private homes nearby. They protected a boarding house where wounded American soldiers lay helpless. Marine barracks and Commandant's house were deliberately spared destruction. Professional soldiers maintained honor codes amid chaos. August 25th arrived with harsh morning light revealing devastation. Smoke still rose from smoldering ruins everywhere. Ross ordered 200 men to secure a fort at Greenleaf's Point. The Americans had destroyed it themselves previously, but 150 barrels of gunpowder remained there. British soldiers attempted to dispose of the powder safely by submerging it. They dropped barrels into a deep well, trying to contain potential explosions. But fine gunpowder dust filled the air dangerously. One spark, one terrible miscalculation. Then catastrophe struck with devastating suddenness. Explosion imminent. The explosion tore through Greenleaf's Point violently. Massive detonation that shook the ground for miles around. 30 British soldiers died instantly in the blast. Several others suffered horrific, gruesome injuries. Bodies flung through the air like rag dolls. The fort became a mass grave. Victory's sudden, terrible cost. Ross and Cockburn faced a critical decision now. Remain in Washington? Continue destruction? Or withdraw before American forces regrouped? The ammunition explosion had rattled nerves badly. The Army was deep in enemy territory. Naval support lay 50 miles away. Vulnerability increased with every passing hour. Then the sky darkened ominously in early afternoon. August 25th. Massive black storm clouds rolled toward Washington from the west. The temperature dropped dramatically. Wind began gusting violently. British soldiers looked skyward with growing unease. Something terrible was approaching rapidly. Nature was awakening. What happened next, neither side anticipated or imagined. Nature intervened with apocalyptic fury, unlike anything witnessed. A tornado estimated Category 2 intensity, with winds reaching 135 miles per hour, slammed into Washington violently. The storm attacked both conquerors and conquered with indiscriminate, devastating violence. Roofs tore from houses instantly. Buildings collapsed entirely. Heavy cannons lifted and hurled several yards through the air effortlessly. Trees uprooted and flew like missiles. Rain fell in torrential sheets, instantly extinguishing the fires consuming Washington. The tornado killed at least 30 American civilians. British soldiers caught in the open-faced nature's wrath completely unprepared. Violent winds knocked seasoned men to the ground like children's toys. Some took shelter in buildings that then collapsed on them fatally. Officers lost control of their units amid the chaos. The disciplined army became scattered, terrified refugees suddenly. Cockburn himself reportedly encountered a Washington resident during the terrifying storm. She shouted that God Almighty had sent the tempest to punish the British invaders. Cockburn, usually confident and mocking, had no witty response this time. The storm humbled even him completely. Divine intervention or coincidence? By evening, August 25th, the decision was made final. British forces would withdraw immediately. The tornado and explosion had transformed victory into vulnerability overnight. Ross ordered a full retreat toward the ships. Washington was saved not by American arms, but by nature's fury. The British Army marched back to their vessels through thick mud and debris. Behind them, Washington smoldered, but survived. The fires that should have consumed the entire capital had been extinguished by torrential rains. Unintentional salvation. The city would rebuild eventually. Ross and Cockburn sailed north toward Baltimore confidently. There, on September 12th, Robert Ross led his troops from the front as always. American snipers hid in the woods patiently. A musket ball struck the general's chest. He died within hours. Leadership proved fatal ultimately. The bombardment of Fort McHenry followed Ross's death. Congreve rockets and bombs rained down for 25 hours straight. Francis Scott Key watched from a British ship, inspired to write verses describing the rocket's red glare. Those Bladensburg rockets found immortality in America's national anthem. In Washington, Reconstruction began slowly and painfully. James Hoban, the White House's original architect, supervised the 3-year rebuild personally. The building was painted white to cover smoke stains permanently. George Washington's portrait returned triumphantly and still hangs today. The only surviving item from 1800, Paul Jennings remained enslaved for 30 more years after that day. In 1847, he purchased his freedom with help from Senator Daniel Webster. In 1865, Jennings published his White House memoirs publicly, the first insider account of presidential life. His crucial role finally acknowledged. History remembers August 24, 1814, as America's darkest moment. Foreign troops burning the Capitol, government fleeing in disarray, defenses collapsing catastrophically. Yet, from that humiliation came resilience. The nation rebuilt stronger, determined never to suffer such devastation again. Shame transformed into resolve. But here's what haunts historians still. Without that tornado, Washington might have burned completely. Every building reduced to ashes. The Capitol relocated elsewhere permanently. America's history forever altered. Sometimes nations are saved not by heroism, but by chance. Remember that uncomfortable truth.